A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey Herman and Corin, so I have one question about an ADHD class of drugs that receives very little attention, but which I have a specific friend who raves about it, and I'm doing this episode because I'd love to understand a bit more about how it works. It's an off-label indication, and I guess one question I have at the very outset is always regarding this off-label prescribing practices. I'm never clear if that means that it's kind of like a physician can't do it if it's not a recognized off-label use, which is I guess a contradiction in terms. But I'm always curious as to how much latitude physicians actually have in this regard. The drug that I'm thinking about is Guanfacine as well as Clonidine. These are two alpha-2 adrenergic receptor agonists, and I know that they're pretty far down the algorithm in ADHD treatment. The first liners being the classics, the amphetamine and methylphenidate agonists, and the second line being the non-stimulant medications we've talked about before, stuff like Strattera or atomoxetine. And these are kind of these further offshoots. I mean, there's other ones like Wellbutrin, but it seems on the surface, just looking at it from my layman's perspective, kind of a paradoxical thing, because we look at these agents like Vyvanse, for example, and we think stimulant. It increases the heart rate, it increases blood pressure, and that's an important part of this conversation here, is what happens if you have ADHD and hypertension. So the idea is always things that increase the motor, as it were, which we talked about from a neurological standpoint, is not quite as simple as just speeding up the brain so much as increasing activity in a specific region. But then we have these drugs that I'm not sure, are they still used even for blood pressure? But they sound like they're doing something very different. So selective alpha-2A adrenergic receptor agonists, I'm just reading from our co-producer here, aka ChatGPT. In ADHD, it enhances prefrontal cortex regulation by strengthening signal transmission and executive control circuits, typically given once a day in extended release format. Compared to Clonidine, Guanfacine is more selective and generally less sedating. So Herman and Corin, I'd love to know a little bit about these drugs and their use in ADHD. How many patients who are diagnosed with ADHD end up on one of these? And is it a drug that can be used in conjunction with something like Vyvanse or maybe even Strattera, or is this a part of the treatment algorithm that if you wind up here, this is what you're on? The other question I have about these drugs for ADHD is there a specific type of ADHD that they're more well suited for? Because the friend who I'm thinking of in recording this podcast, compared to me, is a real long hauler with ADHD. I think he was diagnosed when he was a child, and he's definitely been on stimulants, but this is what he's wound up on, and I think is really happy with it. So I'd love to know a little bit more about why these drugs, why this mechanism of action works, and the concern, I guess, that people have when taking third-line medications, especially older drugs that have been repurposed, is, well, if this drug works for me, am I going to still be able to get it in 2 years, or is this going to vanish? So for those who have that concern that they're on it, I know from having taken a couple of older drugs in my time, nortriptyline for my gallbladder stomach stuff, that they can be really challenging to source, or they can be intermittently available, which creates its own problems when the supply is restricted, and is kind of a hassle that most patients don't really want to undertake. So Herman and Corin, let's talk about the role of alpha-2 agonists in treating attention deficit hyperactivity disorder today in this episode of My Weird Prompts.
You know, Herman, I think we have reached a point in the show where the standard stimulant discussion has been pretty well covered. We have talked about the dopaminergic pathways, the reuptake inhibitors, and the way things like Vyvanse or Ritalin basically act as the fuel for the engine. We've spent hours dissecting how methylphenidate and amphetamines keep that dopamine in the synapse. But today, Daniel sent us a prompt that shifts the focus entirely. He is asking about a class of drugs that, in my experience, usually only gets mentioned as an afterthought in ADHD circles, or perhaps as an add-on when things aren't going quite right. I am talking about the alpha-2 adrenergic receptor agonists, specifically Guanfacine and Clonidine.
Herman Poppleberry here, and let me just say, I am so glad Daniel brought this up. It is one of those topics where the biology is actually more elegant than the stimulants, in my opinion. If you look at the history of neuropsychiatry, we often stumble onto things by accident, and these two drugs are the perfect example of that. Stimulants are like a sledgehammer, right? They just flood the system with neurotransmitters. They are effective, but they are blunt instruments. But alpha-2 agonists are more like a fine-tuning knob on a high-end audio receiver from the 1970s. Daniel actually mentioned that a friend of his raves about them, and honestly, I am not surprised. For the right person, they are life-changing, yet they are often relegated to third-line or off-label status, especially for adults. It is a bit of a tragedy, really, because the science behind them is rock solid.
Well, that is exactly where Daniel wants to start. The off-label aspect. He asked about the latitude physicians have when prescribing these. Because Guanfacine and Clonidine were originally developed and are still used for high blood pressure, they were cardiovascular drugs long before they were psychiatric ones. So if a doctor sees a patient with ADHD in February of 2026, how much freedom do they really have to say, "Hey, let us try this blood pressure pill for your focus and emotional regulation"?
It is a great question, and it touches on the practice of medicine doctrine. In the medical world, off-label prescribing is incredibly common, and it is perfectly legal. Once the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, approves a drug for one thing, say hypertension, a licensed physician can technically prescribe it for anything they believe it will help with, provided there is some level of evidence or clinical rationale. It is not some underground practice. It is actually the standard of care in many specialties. Now, with Guanfacine and Clonidine, it is a bit of a mixed bag. The extended release versions, like Intuitive and Capvi, are actually FDA approved specifically for ADHD in children and adolescents. Intuitive got that stamp back in 2009. However, using the immediate release versions, or using any version for adults, is technically off-label.
So, even though it is common, it is still technically outside the official stamp of approval for the adult population. Why is that? If it works for a 12-year-old, why wouldn't the drug company just get it approved for a 30-year-old?
Money and patents, corn. It always comes back to the economics of the pharmaceutical industry. To get an FDA label for a specific population like adults, the manufacturer has to fund massive, multi-center clinical trials. By the time Intuitive was well established, the patent was nearing its end. Why would a company spend hundreds of millions of dollars to prove it works for adults when the patent is about to expire and generic companies will just swoop in and sell it for pennies? They wouldn't. So we are left in this situation where the clinical evidence is there, the doctors know it works, but the official label remains frozen in time. Most of the ADHD experts I follow argue that the distinction is purely administrative. The underlying biology does not care if you are 12 or 35. If your prefrontal cortex needs more norepinephrine regulation, these drugs are going to do the same thing regardless of the date on your birth certificate.
Let us get into that mechanism then. Daniel asked how these drugs actually work to enhance prefrontal cortex regulation. He used the phrase signal transmission in executive control circuits. Is that just fancy talk he found on a forum, or is that what is actually happening under the hood?
It is exactly what is happening, and this is where it gets nerdy, so bear with me. To understand alpha-2 agonists, you have to understand the prefrontal cortex, or the PFC. This is the CEO of the brain. It is responsible for executive function, impulse control, working memory, and the ability to delay gratification. Now, the neurons in the PFC communicate across synapses, but they are very sensitive to the levels of two specific chemicals, dopamine and norepinephrine. In the PFC, these chemicals don't just excite or inhibit. In a simple way, they tune the strength of the connections.
Right, and usually we think of ADHD as having too little of those. The low dopamine theory that everyone talks about on social media.
Yes, but it is about the balance. Think of it like a radio. If the volume is too low, you cannot hear the music. That is the signal. If there is too much static, you also cannot hear the music. That is the noise. Stimulants generally work by increasing the signal. They boost dopamine so the music is louder. But alpha-2 agonists, specifically guanfacine, work on the noise side. They help the brain filter out the static so the signal can get through more clearly.
Okay, that is one analogy down. You have one left for the rest of the episode, Herman. Use it wisely. I am keeping count.
I will be careful, but seriously, the way it does this is by binding to the alpha-2A receptors on the postsynaptic side of the neuron. This is the crucial part. Most people think of receptors as on-off switches, but these are more like gatekeepers. In the prefrontal cortex, there are these things called HCN channels. Hyperpolarization, activated cyclic nucleotide gated channels. When these channels are open, the electrical signal in the neuron leaks out before it can be passed along to the next neuron. It is like a garden hose with a bunch of tiny holes in it. The signal never reaches the nozzle with enough pressure.
So guanfacine is like the duct tape for the leaky hose?
When guanfacine binds to the alpha-2A receptor, it triggers a chemical cascade that closes those HCN channels. By closing them, it strengthens the connection. It makes the prefrontal cortex more efficient at holding on to information. This is why it is so effective for working memory. If you are trying to remember a phone number while someone is talking to you, your PFC needs to hold that signal steady. If the hose is leaky, the number vanishes. Guanfacine plugs the leaks.
So, instead of just shouting louder like a stimulant, it is making the wires more conductive?
Precisely. It strengthens the signal by preventing leakage. And because it is so specific to the prefrontal cortex, especially guanfacine, which is much more selective than clonidine, you do not get that whole body jitteriness that people often associate with stimulants. You are not boosting the motor system. You are not revving up the heart in the same way. You are just reinforcing the executive control system. It is a bottom-up versus top-down approach. Stimulants push from the bottom. Alpha-2 agonists reinforce from the top.
That explains why Daniel's friend might prefer it. It sounds much more subtle. But Daniel also asked about the prevalence. How many patients are actually using these? Is it a tiny fraction, or is it becoming more mainstream? Because I feel like I hear about Adderall every single day, but I rarely hear someone say, "Hold on, let me take my guanfacine."
It is definitely growing, but it is still far behind the big names. If you look at the prescribing data from 2024 and 2025, stimulants still account for probably 80 to 90% of ADHD prescriptions. However, there has been a significant uptick in non-stimulant prescriptions over the last 3 years. Part of that was driven by the massive stimulant shortages we saw in 2023 and 2024. When people couldn't get their Vyvanse, doctors started looking more seriously at alternatives. Alpha-2 agonists are often used as an adjunct, meaning they are added to a stimulant rather than replacing it. I would estimate that maybe 15 to 20% of ADHD patients are now on an alpha-2 agonist as part of their regimen. Usually, those are the ones who either had bad side effects from stimulants like high heart rate or anxiety, or who have specific symptoms like extreme impulsivity or emotional dysregulation.
That leads into Daniel's question about whether they can be used in conjunction with things like Vyvanse or Strattera. He asked if they are standalone or a team player. It sounds like you're saying they're the ultimate sixth man on the basketball team.
They are the ultimate team players. In fact, many leading clinicians like Dr. Russell Barkley or Dr. William Dodson have argued that the combination of a stimulant and an alpha-2 agonist is the gold standard for complex ADHD. Remember back in episode 834 when we talked about the chemistry of focus, we discussed how dopamine and norepinephrine have this inverted U-shaped curve. You want to be right in the middle, not too little, not too much.
Right. If you have too much, you get anxious, paranoid, and hyper-focused on the wrong things. You end up cleaning your baseboards with a toothbrush instead of writing your thesis.
Now, stimulants boost both dopamine and norepinephrine. But sometimes, to get enough dopamine to focus, you end up with too much norepinephrine in the rest of the body, which causes a racing heart, sweaty palms, or that on-edge feeling. If you add guanfacine, you can often lower the dose of the stimulant. Why? Because the guanfacine is handling the norepinephrine regulation in the prefrontal cortex more efficiently. It balances the side effects. The stimulant wakes you up and provides the drive, and the alpha-2 agonist smooths you out and provides the brakes. It is like having a powerful engine, but also having high-performance brakes and a better steering rack.
What about Strattera, though? That is a non-stimulant, too. Daniel specifically asked about that combo. Does it make sense to take two non-stimulants?
It can, but it is less common and requires a very skilled prescriber. Strattera, or atomoxetine, is a norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. It increases the total amount of norepinephrine available in the synapses. Guanfacine, on the other hand, changes how the brain responds to that norepinephrine by mimicking it at the receptor site. They are working on different parts of the same system. Some people do find success with that combo, especially if they have a total intolerance for stimulants, but usually you see guanfacine paired with something like Adderall, Vyvanse, or Concerta. The synergy there is much more established in the literature.
Daniel also asked if there is a specific type of ADHD these are better suited for. He mentioned his friend has been a long hauler with ADHD and has tried everything. Is there a profile for the ideal Guanfacine candidate?
There absolutely is. While the stimulants are great for the cognitive side, the focus, the task initiation, the getting off the couch, part alpha-2 agonists shine when it comes to the emotional and physical side of ADHD. If a patient struggles with what we call emotional lability, where their moods swing rapidly from 0 to 60, or if they have severe rejection-sensitive dysphoria, or RSD, guanfacine can be a godsend.
I have heard that term rejection-sensitive dysphoria coming up more and more in the community lately. It seems like a huge hurdle for a lot of people. It is that intense emotional pain from perceived criticism, right?
It is massive. And here's the thing. Stimulants sometimes make RSD worse. Because stimulants increase arousal, they can increase that feeling of being raw or exposed. Alpha-2 agonists tend to lower the baseline of emotional reactivity. They give you that half second of pause before you react to something. It is like they thicken your skin a little bit. It is also the go-to choice for ADHD patients who have co-occurring tic disorders or Tourette syndrome. Stimulants can often trigger or worsen tics, whereas guanfacine actually helps suppress them. In fact, guanfacine was used for tics long before it was widely used for ADHD.
And what about the hyperactive impulsive side versus the inattentive side?
It is traditionally seen as better for the hyperactive and impulsive types. If you think about it, impulsivity is a failure of the prefrontal cortex to say no to the rest of the brain. By strengthening those PFC circuits, you are essentially giving the brakes a fresh set of pads. For the purely inattentive type, the daydreamer who just struggles to stay awake or engaged, a stimulant is usually more effective because they need that push. But for the person who is constantly distracted by their own emotions, or by every shiny thing in the room, or who blurts things out before they can stop themselves, the alpha-2 agonist provides that much needed filtering. It is about interference control.
Let us talk about the downsides for a second, because this sounds almost too good to be true. If it fixes the emotions and the tics and the focus without the jitters, why isn't everyone on it? There has to be a catch.
Well, the biggest one is sedation. These were blood pressure meds first, remember? They work by telling the sympathetic nervous system to chill out. For some people, that chill out is too much. They feel like they are walking through a fog or moving through molasses. This is especially true with clonidine, which is much more sedating than guanfacine. Clonidine hits all three subtypes of the alpha-2 receptor, A, B, and C, whereas guanfacine is much more selective for the alpha-2A subtype in the brain.
So clonidine is the heavy hitter that might knock you out, and guanfacine is the more surgical strike.
That is why clonidine is often prescribed to be taken at night. It helps with the ADHD-related insomnia, which we touched on in episode 495. If you have a brain that won't shut up at 2 in the morning, clonidine can be a miracle. It lowers the internal noise so you can actually drift off. But if you take it at 10 in the morning, you might find yourself napping through your lunch break. Guanfacine is better for daytime use because it has a longer half-life and is less sedating, but even then, the drop in blood pressure can cause dizziness, fatigue, or orthostatic hypotension, that feeling of getting lightheaded when you stand up too fast. You have to titrate it very slowly, often over a month or more, to let your body adjust.
That brings us to Daniel's final point, and it is one that I think is really important for anyone who relies on these medications in the current landscape: the availability and sourcing. Daniel mentioned his own experience with a drug called nortriptyline, and how older repurposed drugs can be a nightmare to find. Why is that? Why would a drug that has been around for 40 years be harder to get than a brand new expensive one?
It is a frustrating paradox of the pharmaceutical industry in 2026. When a drug is old and out of patent, it becomes a commodity. The profit margins for the manufacturers drop to almost nothing. So, you have fewer companies willing to make it. If one factory in India or China has a quality control issue and has to shut down for an inspection, there is no backup capacity in the system. The whole global supply chain for that generic drug can collapse overnight because no one else is incentivized to keep extra stock on hand.
So, because it is cheap, nobody wants to make it. And because nobody wants to make it, any small hiccup becomes a massive shortage. That seems like a broken system for something as vital as brain medication.
It is absolutely broken. We saw this with the generic guanfacine shortages in late 2024, and with these drugs there is another layer of complexity. Because the extended release versions, like Intuniv, are branded or were branded until recently. The insurance companies often push patients toward the immediate release generic versions because they cost $5 instead of $50. But those generic versions are often the ones facing the most supply volatility. If you are an adult taking the immediate release version off-label, you are at the mercy of a very fragile supply chain.
Daniel's friend is worried that if this drug works for him, it might just vanish in 2 years. Is that a realistic fear? Should he be looking for something more modern?
It is a valid concern, but I would not say it is a reason to avoid the medication. Usually, these shortages are temporary, a few weeks or a month. But for a patient, temporary can mean a very difficult month of withdrawal or returning symptoms. And here is the really important part. Because these drugs affect blood pressure, you cannot just stop them cold turkey. If you've been taking an alpha-2 agonist for months and you suddenly stop because the pharmacy is out of stock, you can get what is called rebound hypertension. Your blood pressure can spike to dangerous levels higher than it was before you started.
That sounds incredibly dangerous. So, if there is a shortage and you cannot get your refill, you are not just losing your focus, you are potentially facing a medical emergency.
It is something doctors have to be very careful about. They usually advise patients to never let their supply run down to the last pill. You want a 2-week buffer if possible. But yes, the sourcing of older drugs is a real problem. It is something we actually talked about a bit in episode 485 regarding the manufacturing of prodrugs. Even the new stuff isn't immune, but the old, cheap stuff is uniquely vulnerable to these market failures because there is no middleman making enough profit to care about the logistics.
It is interesting that we are seeing this trend of going back to these older drugs. It is like we are rediscovering tools that were sitting in the back of the shed because we were so focused on the shiny new stimulants. We are looking at blood pressure meds. We are looking at old antidepressants like nortriptyline. It feels like a retro movement in psychiatry.
I think it is part of a broader shift toward precision psychiatry or personalized medicine. For a long time, the medical community treated ADHD as a monolithic disorder. You have it or you don't, and you take a stimulant. But now we are realizing that the presentation is so diverse. One person's ADHD is driven by a lack of dopamine in the reward centers, the I can't get started type. Another person's is driven by a lack of regulation in the prefrontal cortex, the I can't stop myself type. As we get better at identifying those subtypes through clinical observation, these older drugs are becoming more relevant than ever. They target the regulatory side of the equation.
I want to circle back to the prefrontal cortex regulation for a second, because I think there is a nuance there that we might have skipped. When we talk about executive control circuits, we are talking about the ability to prioritize. One of the things people with ADHD often say is that everything feels equally important. The laundry, the work email, the bird outside the window, the feeling of the tag on their shirt. How does strengthening those ion channels help with that specific problem of everything is loud?
That is where the second analogy comes in. You ready?
This is it. Number 2. Make it count, Puppleberry.
Imagine the prefrontal cortex is a castle, and there are all these messengers trying to get in with news from the kingdom. If the gates are wide open and broken, all the messengers rush in at once, shouting. The king. Your conscious mind is overwhelmed. He cannot decide which message is important. Is the dragon attacking the village? Message more important than the "we ran out of milk" message? He can't tell because they are both screaming in his face. By using an alpha-2 agonist, you are essentially fixing the gates and hiring a very disciplined guard. You are making it so that only the messengers with the correct password can get through easily.
Okay, that is the second analogy. You are officially cut off now. No more metaphors for the rest of the day.
Fair enough. But the point is that by closing those HCN channels, you are increasing the resistance of the neuronal membrane. In physics terms, this means that a weak, distracting signal like the bird outside doesn't have enough electrical power to trigger the neuron. It just fizzles out. But a strong, intentional signal like the work email you are focusing on does have enough power. It raises the threshold for what the brain considers worth paying attention to. It creates a biological filter. Stimulants make the important thing louder, but alpha-2 agonists make the unimportant things quieter.
That is a really powerful distinction. It explains why some people feel more peaceful on these drugs. It is not just that they can focus, it is that the world feels less noisy and aggressive.
And for someone who has lived their whole life in a world where everything is shouting at them at once, that peace is profound. It is also why it helps so much with that emotional regulation. If you can filter out the minor annoyances, the way someone looked at you, or a slight change in someone's tone of voice, you don't have that massive emotional spike. You have more bandwidth to process the situation rationally. You are no longer a slave to every incoming stimulus.
We have covered a lot of ground here. We have talked about the off-label legality, the neurobiology of HCN channels, the gold standard team-up with stimulants, and the supply chain issues of 2026. If you had to give Daniel's friend one piece of advice, or one thing to watch out for as he continues this journey with Guanfacine, what would it be?
I would say pay very close attention to your hydration and your salt intake, especially in the first 2 months. Because these drugs affect blood pressure and the sympathetic nervous system, being even slightly dehydrated can make the side effects like dizziness or that heavy limb feeling much worse. And be patient with the titration. It can take 4 to 6 weeks to really feel the full benefit of the prefrontal cortex strengthening. It is not like a stimulant where it hits you in 30 minutes and you feel like a superhero. It is a slow structural shift in how your brain processes information. It is more like growing a muscle than turning on a light switch.
That is a great point. It is a marathon, not a sprint. And I think it is also worth mentioning that if someone is interested in this, they really need to find a psychiatrist who understands these non-stimulant options. Not every doctor is comfortable with them, especially for adults, because they still view them through the lens of 1980s hypertension medicine.
Very true. Many general practitioners still think of these as just blood pressure meds and might be hesitant to prescribe them for ADHD because they aren't familiar with the Yale research. You want someone who stays up on the latest work being done by researchers like Amy Arnsten. She has really pioneered our understanding of how these drugs work at the molecular level in the primate brain. Her work on how stress opens those HCN channels and how guanfacine closes them is the foundation of everything we talked about today.
It is fascinating how much our understanding of the brain has evolved. We used to think it was all about the amount of chemicals, like a soup where you just needed more salt. Now we realize it is about the architecture of the circuits themselves, and how leaky the wires are.
It really is. And as we move forward toward 2030, I expect we will see even more targeted drugs that hit specific receptor subtypes without the blood pressure side effects. But for now, these repurposed medications are filling a huge gap for people who don't fit the standard stimulant model. Daniel, thanks for sending this in. It is a topic that definitely deserves more than the little attention it usually gets in the ADHD sphere.
It is a reminder that sometimes the most interesting solutions are the ones we already had, just used in a new way. It is about looking at the old tools with fresh eyes. And to our listeners, if you have experience with these alpha-2 agonists, maybe you're on the gold standard combo, or you've struggled with the sedation, we would love to hear about it. Does the leaky hose metaphor resonate with you? Or do you feel that fog we talked about?
Yeah, hearing from the community is always the best part. It helps us ground the science in real-world experience. And hey, if you are finding these deep dives helpful, please do us a favor and leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It really does help the show reach more people who might be struggling to find the right treatment path.
It really does. You can find us at myweirdprompts.com, where we have the full archive of over 800 episodes. We have covered everything from the chemistry of focus to the logistics of medication shortages. If you want to get in touch, you can use the contact form there or email us at show@myweirdprompts.com.
And if you want to dive deeper into the specific stimulant side of things to compare, check out episode 688 where we talked about Vyvanse and diet, or episode 485 for more on the biology of prodrugs and how they are manufactured. There is a whole world of neurochemistry out there to explore.
Well, I think that is a wrap for today. My brain feels a little more tuned just talking about this. This has been My Weird Prompts. I am Corn.
And I am Herman Poppleberry.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We will catch you in the next one.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the close from slow